Hey, I just talked to speaker. She's joining in another 2 minutes.
Hi everybody. I just want to check if my audio and my slides are visible. If I'm audible and if the screen that I'm sharing is visible.
I can see it and hear you loud and clear.
Okay, great.
So I guess we will start. Yes. So today's topic, as many of you know, is does technology have politics? Stravia is a long-time free software activist. I know her from the FSFTN days when I think this is way back in 2014. A long-time friend and an activist. Um, so today's talk, I think we're not going to be sticking to free software in general, but generally exploring technology as an idea. Um, so I guess we'll hand it over to Stravia to get the session started.
Right. Thanks, Ram. Hello everybody. Like Ram mentioned, my name is Shravya. I've been involved with the free software movement in Tamil Nadu for over 7 years now. And as part of my involvement with the free software movement, I've been contributing to projects like Wikipedia and Inkscape and also OpenStreetMap. And besides that, I've also interacted with a lot of college students, mostly from the engineering background in Tamil Nadu, introducing free software and helping them set up some of these free software clubs in their colleges. That's a brief introduction about me. Professionally speaking, I'm a technology researcher. And part of what I want to discuss today also comes from that training a bit. And just before we get started, I wanted to flag a couple of things in case at any point I'm not audible or there's a lag or any of that. So please feel free to either interrupt, switch on audio and interrupt, or on the chat. And if I've not looked at the chat for a bit, also please point me to look at it. Questions, once again, at any point, feel free to interject and add your comments and questions, or alternatively, if you're comfortable adding them on the chat, that works as well. And from time to time, I'll check the chat window. So that's that. And Ram has reminded me that I should read out questions that might come in the chat in case for folks who might be watching this on YouTube. So those are sort of the smaller logistics things that I wanted to sort of keep out. And so, yeah, I will get started. So I titled today's talk as Does Technology Have Politics? Because this is something that affects, impacts all our lives on a day-to-day basis in several ways. And I hope we could have a discussion around the politics of technology itself. And what I'm most keen about through this talk, and I'm really eager to also hear what others in today's session might have to say, is how we understand the term technology itself, and how we understand and relate to politics. I'm hoping this session is useful to sort of unpack what we refer to often by using these two terms. And these two terms are most commonly used these days, right? Right from what we see in the news to even in our everyday discussions among friends and family, these two words are almost indispensable right now. So, quickly, when we think about politics itself, the question that I want to begin with is how we understand politics. So, the most common understanding of politics would be to think about politics as government, that it's the BJP government, it's the Congress government, or any of the other uh, parties that might be in power. So we often tend to associate politics with what the wha- uh, the government of the day is. Alternatively, politics is also understood in terms of the political parties and politicians, and also sometimes the ideologies that they represent. That this is BJP's politics, again, this is Congress's politics, this is the politics of Trinamool Congress or any other party, right? So we also tend to think about and talk about politics in terms of electoral politics, in terms of parties, politicians, and ideologies. That's one kind. And also, if your experiences are somewhat similar to mine, you would have also heard or come across the use of politics itself as a negative, in a very negative connotation, which is to say, don't play politics in this, or these are people who are trying to play politics in something that's very simple. This also is something you often come across in conversations within the family, among other kinds of social and peer group, where there's a very negative connotation to what doing politics really means, right? So these are ways in which we've been talking about politics for ages. But is there a way in which we can understand what politics really means? So that's where I want to introduce the idea of looking at politics as power. Here, I'm specifically referring to the work of a social scientist called Langdon Winner, who's written about the politics of artifacts at length. And he has defined politics as arrangements of power and authority in human associations, as well as in the activities that take place in those arrangements. So the core idea is to look at politics in terms of power relations, rather than looking at politics as a specific institution, or as politics as something that only a certain select group of people do, or only few people who are labeled as politicians as the only ones indulging in politics. The idea is really to think about politics as a more expansive idea that impacts and involves all of us. And when we think about it as a power arrangement, as power relations in the society that we live in, and then maybe the conversations around politics can also perhaps change. So going forward throughout this talk and the discussion that follows, I would really encourage if we could think about move away from the narrow conception of politics that we're mostly familiar with, and try and think about politics in terms of power. The who has power in several of the arrangements that we live in, be it the building we might be living in, or within our household, or in our place of work, in our place of education, and even largely between the government and the citizen. What are power relations in each of these contexts, and how what is our role in those arrangements of power, and how that power or lack of it might impact our lives. So thinking about politics as power is what would help us also understand the politics of technology as well. So when we think about, so even here, when drawing on what Vinod has said, thinking about politics as power, it is still something human, right? Like when we think about arrangements of power in human associations, we tend to think about within the family, it is often uh, the father figure who is considered the head of the family. That's an arrangement of power that is political. Or when we look at, for instance, in the context of a school or in the context of a workplace, there is a clear definition of there's a clear image of who the head is or who the boss is. So when this is in a very when power relations seem to exist in human associations, in human relationships, how do we then think about power in terms of technology? Technology is just an artifact, right? It's just a thing. So if can a thing have politics? That is not something that's very intuitive. In fact, even in Langdon's, I mean, in Winner's work, he himself also notes that we all know that people have politics, but it's not. We do not associate politics or power with things. And when we do talk about generally the politics of technology, what we tend to usually do is think about the politics in terms of the social or economic system in which it is embedded. For instance, if we were to talk about let's say a system like Aadhaar, which is a technological system of identification that's being used widely in the country right now and has been used for close to a decade now. And when we talk about the politics of something like Aadhaar, the conversation also tends to center around like the economic or the social conditions under which the technology is being used, the decisions that this government might have taken versus the previous government, and things like that. But what is important is, while these factors definitely shape what the technology may or may not do, it's also important to engage with the design of the technology itself that influences the politics of the said technology. So the idea of thinking about technology and politics and asking the question whether technology has politics is to recognize that the technology not only is embedded in a political system, but at the same time, the technology itself has politics that is often reflected in its design, and that's something we could discuss. And so there are two ways in which we could look at the politics of technology broadly. So the first kind is politics that is embedded in the design of the technology. So here, the image on the right is uh, is an image from the 1950s, if I'm not wrong. This is a bridge at. This is actually a roadway, a highway in New York, in a place called Long Island, where this is a road that is leading up to a beach where people often travel for recreation, right? So this is a road that leads to a beach, and this was a sort of an overpass that was constructed there. So one of the striking things about this overpass in this particular road is, if you look at it, the height of the bridge itself is quite low, which is, even though you see some people walking on top, you see a car that is approaching on the road, and while that might pass through, there are certain other vehicles that wouldn't. For instance, a, uh, any vehicle of which is taller than a car might not be able to comfortably pass through this bridge. So, are there any guesses as to why this is relevant when we're talking about the politics being embedded in design? That the roadway has a bridge which is of a which has a low height, or which allows only certain vehicles to pass, and may prevent other kinds of vehicles to pass, had a very direct sort of an implication on who might be actually able to access the beach, and who might be excluded from access to recreational sites in Long Island. So a lot at that time, when racial prejudice was at its peak in New York, this bridge was constructed in a way that only cars could pass through could travel on this road leading up to the beach. Whereas if public transport, like buses, for example, wouldn't be able to take this road because the bus wouldn't be. So this height of this particular sort of pathway is about 9 feet tall, and a bus is typically 12 feet tall. So a bus would never be able to pass through this particular area, which meant that essentially the beach was accessible to folks who were able to afford. Who had and were able to afford cars, but the beach remained inaccessible to people who did not own cars of their own and were reliant on public transport to move from one part of the city to another. And what is also important is to understand that at the time that we are speaking, which is 1940s and 50s, it was also only the significantly, it was the white population that owned cars and were able to therefore access the beaches, and the black population in New York, which mostly depended on public transport, were therefore effectively cut off from being able to visit these beaches. And this was a very conscious part of the design of this particular architecture, because Moses, who was the city planner, and this project was part of a larger, this particular roadway was part of a larger project that he was working on, was infamous for such design that embedded this racial politics into the city's infrastructure itself. So this is an example that Winner himself uses while talking about the first kind of politics in technology, which is politics that is often reflected in the design of the technological artifact. So if we were to merely raise the height of this bridge to, let's say, 15 feet, then perhaps even buses and therefore black people would be able to access those beaches. But clearly that was a conscious decision that was made to sort of enforce the exclusion that they wanted to see. So this is an example from the 1950s, and it is not to say that we don't see some of these even today, or someplace even perhaps closer home. Any guesses as to where this bridge is, especially folks uh, from Karnataka, or who are familiar with Bangalore? Any guess as to where this particular bridge may be seen? Yeah, the Electronic City flyover. So this is the Electronic City flyover, which is about 8 or 12 kilometers long, if I'm not wrong. So this is a toll expressway, you get a toll of about 40 or 45 rupees one way, and I think it is 70 for a two-way toll ticket. So, and the remarkable thing about this flyover is again that you will see buses going on it. It's not to say that public transport is not allowed. You will see cars, you will see two-wheelers, but what will be missing on these flyovers is autos. Autos are not allowed on this particular flyover. I lived in Electronic City for the last couple of years, but I've never been able to conclusively find out why autos are never allowed on this flyover. If anybody on the call actually knows why autos aren't allowed, I'd be very interested to know. But it is curious that when you build a flyover, a city infrastructure that is meant for public use and public access, decides that only certain kinds of vehicles can be allowed to use it, and some kinds of vehicles cannot be allowed to access this public infrastructure. And the question there to ask, it's not to say that the idea is not to ask whether this is right or wrong or good or bad, but to think about for a second, who are the people who are then excluded when we design a flyover where autos are not allowed to ride? So, who are the people who frequently use autos? Who are people who will not be able to reach the other side of Electronic City or from Electronic City to this to somewhere like Silk Board if autos aren't allowed to fly on the flyover? It is also reflective of the kind of uh, design that is embedded in this bridge from the 1950s in the US, where the simply by designing an infrastructure or an artifact a certain way, the politics or the intent is sort of embedded in that design of this particular technology. So this is one kind of technology where by perhaps changing the design of the technology, by maybe tweaking the height, or maybe by, if for example, if the idea is that it cannot bear the weight, or if it is about if it's questions of speed, maybe at the design level, if these were addressed, some of these power relations could be changed. Perhaps even the black population and the black community in the US could have accessed those beaches. Maybe even autos would be able to ride and fly on these flyovers. But the question is then, is everything only a factor of design? If we are able to modify design, then can we, as a consequence, always correct the politics and power relations that a technology reflects? Is a question to ask. And that's where there is a second type of politics in technology. The first was, of course, the politics that is embedded in the design of the technology. The second is what is called inherently political technologies. And here I want to use the example of power generation to sort of draw the differences between the two. So the first image on the left is an example of is a nuclear power plant, and the where the nuclear power plant, as many of you might know, is a very capital intensive technology. It requires a huge investment of money and space and infrastructure to be able to generate nuclear power. And because of the kind of environmental hazards that nuclear power poses, there are, or at least there should be, a lot of environmental clearance, checks and balances to make sure that nuclear power generation does not cause harm, especially to communities that live near to these power plants. So, which is why anywhere in the world you would see that nuclear power generation is often, the capacity to generate nuclear power often rests with big players, which almost usually tends to be the state. The government is the only entity that generates nuclear power. And by design, the technology of nuclear power itself requires consolidation of power and consolidation of economic power, and to be able to build and maintain this technology, and which is what makes something like a nuclear power plant inherently centralized. As a technology, it is an inherently centralizing technology. In contrast, if we take something like the solar power plant, the image on the left, on the right, sorry, is an example of a solar panel that you might find on the roof of any building that might be using solar power. So, right from the cost of installation to building and maintaining it, the ability for any even if not any, the ability for far more people and far more entities to be involved in something like solar power generation uh, inherently decentralizes solar power as a technology. And this is so there is no way, the way this is different from the first kind of politics in technology is that even if we changed the design of nuclear power plants to any extent, there is no way we're going to see you and I or anybody in this call or all of us even together setting up a nuclear power plant and running it on our own. Whereas we will be able to uh, install and run our own solar power. So there are some, and another example of inherently political technology could also be dams. Dams are again such huge infrastructure projects, often incurring a lot of cost, that these are projects that can be built and maintained only by a player as big and powerful as the state. So there are a second set of technologies that are inherently political in the sense that they give and consolidate, give and maintain power only in the hands of select few, and no matter how the design of the technology might be tweaked and changed, the power relations don't tend to change. For instance, even if the number of nuclear power plants were to increase in India, all of them would still be continued to be run and maintained, and therefore the power of nuclear power generation would remain in the hands of, let's say, the government only. So that's the difference we need to keep in mind. On the one hand, we have technologies where we might be able to change the design or the implementation of that technology to change the power relations it might reflect. And on the other hand, there are technologies that are inherently political, that the technology cannot be tweaked to change the power relations that it may convey. And we only the alternatives that are conceived from the beginning with a different kind of power relations can actually change the power relation that is seen in, let's say, a centralizing system versus a decentralized system, like in the case of solar and nuclear power. So, well, we've talked about like bridges, we've talked about solar power and nuclear power. None of this is digital technology, and I'm sure most people on the call, when you looked at it at a session that said, does technology have politics, were most often thinking about digital technologies. Well, we could use the same framing and understanding of tech power as politics to think about what this means in the context of digital technologies. So we're familiar with, let's say, the Windows operating system or the Microsoft Office suite, and which is what we call proprietary software. So proprietary software is basically software that is built and developed and maintained and distributed by often a large corporate, or where with the users of this software do not have the rights to modify or share the software that they're using. The rights of modification or sharing rest solely with the proprietor of the software, which in the case of Windows would be Microsoft, and hence the name proprietary, right? So, in the case of proprietary software, how might we think about the power relations? And once again, here, I'm sure there are folks on this call who are free software activists themselves. And the question that I'm posing is not something that is new at all to them. But rather than again thinking about whether proprietary software is good or bad, right or wrong, for a second, if we could think about the power relations that proprietary software reflects. Uh, how can we understand the power relations that a proprietary software reflects? So when we say power relations, who are the players in that come into play? One is of course the company itself, let's say for example Microsoft, and on the other hand we have its users. So in the case of something like the Windows operating system or the Microsoft Office suite or the Outlook email, so what is the power relation between the company and its users, the product, the software and its users? The relationship is one of limited use. The relationship is one of we will give you a set of features as Microsoft, and you as a user can use whatever we give you, and you are not allowed. You are prohibited, in fact, legally from sharing and distributing this on your own, and you are definitely forbidden from trying to change anything in the software. If you want a certain feature, you just hope and pray that we do implement and build those features somewhere down the line. And again, that's a process you hold no influence over. So the power dynamics between the Windows user and Microsoft uh, is stark in the sense that the model of development, the proprietary model of software development, limits the participation of the user in how the software is built and what the software does and or cannot do. And for those of you who are interested, I'd highly encourage that you look up this the open letter that Bill Gates wrote to hobbyists back in 1970s. So hobbyists are loose was the term loosely used to refer to geeks who are interested in tweaking and meddling with hardware and software to try and build some of these technologies. So his gripe was that as a student in MIT, along with a couple of peers, he was building an operating system, and he accused some of these hobbyists or free software geeks of stealing his software and not paying the due. That's an interesting conversation of its own, and I'd really recommend those of you who are interested to check out this open letter to hobbyists that Bill Gates is infamous for. So that is one kind of software, and the design and the power relations of the software is also reflected in its design. Now, what happens if we modified that sort of development cycle or development process? What if the software that also not only lets you use it, but also lets you investigate what are the components that make up the software, how allow you to share and allow you to modify that software? That would drastically change the power relations between the user and the software itself. And that is where something like the free software comes in. For example, like Linux or VLC Media Player or a project like Wikipedia or OpenStreetMaps. All of these are projects that projects, operating systems, tools like VLC Media Player that imbibe and reflect these values. Very briefly, for those of you who are new to looking at free software, the idea is very simple. Free software basically means that software that allows you to do four things. One is you should be able to run the software. Two is yes. So, oh yes. the zeroth freedom is to be able to run the software. The first freedom is to be able to study and investigate what the software, how the software works, then to be able to share the software with peers and distribute it to friends. And the last and the final freedom that free software gives you is to be able to modify and redistribute those modified versions as well. So I realize the numbers are wrong in this particular image. It should be 0123 and not 0134, as Ganesh has pointed out in the chat. So again, in the case of free software, how can we think about the power relations between the software and its user? Here, the software allows its users to not only use, but also engage with it at a level to be able to, it gives them more rights and more freedom over the software that they own and use. They are able to, if I want to share it with the rest of my class, I could do it. If I wanted to modify it and make a version that is light so that my classmates can install it on their system, that's again something they could do. If I wanted to change the layout of the complete layout of this particular software and write a sort of different desktop environment for it, if it's an operating system, I could do that. And I can move around a whole set of pieces within that particular software. And just a second. Okay, sorry. Yeah, sorry. And then I will be able to do all of those because free software allows me to do that. And free software, a user of free software is able to do that because of what is called the GPL license, the general public license, which is different from a proprietary software that will often ask us to sign on its end user's license agreement, where we just click on a I agree to all your terms and conditions that says that you are not allowed to share, use, share, change, or modify anything in this software. So again, here with free software, it's useful to think about how this design of participation changes participation in the development of the software itself, changes the power relations between the user of a free software and the software itself. While proprietary software limits the participation of its users in the development of that software, free software encourages, not only allows, but it also encourages users to participate in the development of that software and believes that their participation and involvement actually improves the quality of the software itself. And in that sense, free software privileges the rights of the users that it serves. So this corresponds to something like the bridge itself. If we were to change how the bridge was built, then perhaps it could be more inclusive. And similarly, if we were to change the mode of development of software, software too could be more inclusive and participatory in that sense. So this is one kind of politics. Another example again of this kind could be we're all familiar with the platform economy. I'm sure all of us at some point at least have used either Ola or Uber or food delivery services like Swiggy, Zomato, or even more recently Dunzo, and a whole range of other platform-based services that have come up. I'm sure I can't get the names of all of them. So what is interesting about all of these platforms that I mentioned so far are they very strategically say that they are intermediaries. So they say that, for instance, Uber has repeatedly argued both publicly and in courts that they are intermediaries in the sense that as Uber, we are a technology company. We are not a transport company, and therefore the transport rules or regulations don't apply to us. We're only an intermediary that connects drivers and to their customers, and we play no more role than that. But it's also useful to think about what is the politics of a platform like Uber or Ola. So if we were to again apply the idea of politics as power relations, how can we understand the power relations that a platform like an Uber or Ola reflects? So let's think about it. Who are the players who are involved in a platform like Uber and Ola? There are three sets of players to begin with. At the most simplest level, we have Uber or Ola itself, which is one, the platform. On the one hand, we have the users, customers like us, and on the other hand, we have the drivers. And what is the role that a platform like Uber or Ola plays? So one thing is it determines when I try to book a ride on Ola, it tells me who my driver for the particular ride is going to be. I have no I mean, I don't get to choose who that is. I have no autonomy over who ends up giving me a ride. That is a decision that the platform makes. And similarly for the driver, they don't have a choice in terms of where they're asked to like take a ride and where the destination might be. They're simply sent a location and said that their pickup is waiting there. So in terms of determining what their ride is, the platform is the one making the decision. Secondly, what is the cost of that ride? Who is going to be how much am I going to pay for that particular ride is once again determined by the platform. The platform sets the rate for the per kilometer rate, and it sets the formula by which that the cost of the ride is calculated. For example, if I delay and leave the driver waiting, there's a penalty on my end. And if the driver delays, for example, and I'm not able to reach him or he's unavailable for whatever reason, then he loses the ride if he's not able to respond to his customer quickly. So again, these are rules that the platform sets. And finally, we also have something like rating where the driver rates the customer and the customer rates the driver. And these also determine, especially for the driver, what kinds of incentives and what kinds of rights they might get in the rest of the day. So in that sense, the platform actually shapes a lot of a huge chunk of the sort of the livelihood, in fact, in the case of the drivers, what money they might or might not make, and what their livelihood even looks like. So today, if Ola decides that the kilometer rate is going to be 8 kilometers, I mean 8 rupees per kilometer, then they have a very direct bearing on the lives of the drivers. And if they decide to increase it to, let's say, 18 rupees, or drastically bring it down to 2 rupees, all of it has significant impact both for the driver as well as for the customers also. And what is again important to think about is contrasting this with a, a time when we just walked on the road and got hailed an auto or a taxi, where there was room for negotiation, and the negotiation was direct between the driver who was offering the ride and the customer who would take the ride. But that is not the case anymore, and there's very little room for bargaining. uh, and the for instance, if I'm not happy with the cost of the ride that Uber or Ola shows me, I just don't take the ride. That's it. There's no room for me to say that if it's 10 rupees lesser, I will take the ride. Similarly, there is no room for negotiation even at the driver's end. They just have to make do with whatever Ola decides or Uber decides is the rate. And yet, these platforms often argue that they're just intermediaries, and they often also use terms that try and make it sound like the drivers, especially, are almost entrepreneurs who can at will switch on and switch off their service, and that's kind of empowering for them. So, for example, both these platforms call their drivers driver partners, like their association is only one of partnership and not employment, because they aren't salaried employees of these platforms. However, despite not being salaried employees, a lot of their life and their work is constantly shaped by the platform, right? From how many rides they do that day, where these drops end up being, how much they earn, even to down to what route they might be taking, and what is the consequence of something like customer rating. All of these are influenced, and all of these are norms that are set independently by the platform alone. And therein lies the politics of the platform based services. Looking at, again, going beyond the binary of good and bad and right and wrong, thinking about like the power relations, it's clear that in the case of an on demand platform like uh, uh, like on-demand platforms like Uber and Ola, the power relations are very clear that bulk of the power rests in the hands of Uber and Ola and not in the hands of its customers, or most definitely not in the hands of its drivers. So there is a comment in the chat where Niranjan says, "Hunger warriors, poor food delivery guys, they're fighting for others' hunger when they find it difficult to cater to their own hunger." Absolutely, that's the reason why I added it, to just say that even during a time like the pandemic right now, they've been, especially in the case of food delivery, they've been called frontline workers and recognized as an essential service. And even without the most basic protections and personal protective equipment, they're asked to continue doing their work. And they've just been called some names, glorifying names like hunger warriors. I think Swiggy called them hunger warriors, saying they're fighting hunger, where in fact they are the ones who are left to be hungry and not the ones who order food from the platform. So that is in the context of the platform economy, how the platforms intermediaries and how these platforms have come in as intermediaries and changed the power relations between a taxi driver or an auto driver and their customers. And if we were to, let's say, if this is embedded in the design of the platform, how can this, by changing the design of this particular platform, can the power relations be changed in this system? Most definitely, yes. There have been attempts and projects that have tried to build a platform that allows the users and the drivers to negotiate on chat or on call, and then come to an understanding about like the rate of the ride itself. So, for example, when Uber and Ola were really booming in India a few years back, when they were on the rise, the Kali Pili taxis in Mumbai also sought to build an app of their own, so that one which gives them more bargaining power, and so that they don't lose their customers to an Uber or Ola. So that there are definitely ways in which these even when we have a platform, we could change the power relations in a way that is very different from what is seen on these on an Uber or an Ola. And that when I say that this is the politics of these platforms, it is not to say that this is the only way in which they can be conceived. The idea is to call attention to the design of these platforms, and then perhaps we could have a discussion around how this can be conceived differently. So these are examples around how technology design reflects the politics that it embeds. And then we saw the other kind, which is inherently political technologies. And I think we don't have to look beyond Aadhaar to look to understand this in the context of digital tech. So Aadhaar as a unique identification system is a technology that was that is inherently centralized. It when it says that Aadhaar deduplicates and eliminates any people who might be sort of stealing your identity and misusing it. The way it does it is by having a centralized system, a centralized uh, database where you have the biometrics and like the fingerprint and iris scan, and now even the photographs of all of us in one centralized system. And the idea that any service, any public service, at least in India, should be able to identify and deduplicate is hinged on the idea that there will be one particular centralized database, and all services can ping and refer to this particular database to identify folks. The idea of using this one biometrics based system for identification across services itself is inherently centralizing, that it is not possible to conceive an Aadhaar like system in a more decentralized fashion. So this is an example of how, even if we were to change the design of Aadhaar, and this design has undergone several revisions, right? And I'm sure people on this call are more familiar with uh, with the design iterations that Aadhaar has seen. So even as the design of Aadhaar itself has undergone several changes, what remains core is the fact that it is a deeply centralizing project, and it will continue to remain so because that is the only way in which a unique biometrics based ID system would work when it is meant to be a foundational ID, one without a purpose and therefore fulfilling all purposes kind of a narrative. So, and again, this is very different even if we take something like rations, for example. We have ration cards that identify people and has a very specific purpose, and these are issued by states. And something like Aadhaar is now not only used for rations alone, but right from births to like marriage to some even issuing death certificates, all of it is tied to Aadhaar, and that is in fact the idea, to have centralized control over the identity of people. And the idea is to be aware of its centralizing nature when we think about the politics of Aadhaar, especially in the context of Aadhaar. A lot of the conversation has been around, and rightly so, in talking about what the government of the day has done to the project since it took over in 2014, and how the project has also been shaped by lobbyist groups like Nandan Nilekani and his peers. But while that is an important part of the discussion, it's also important to pay attention to the design of the technology itself and recognize that it is an inherently centralizing technology design. And there are only limited changes that we can hope to bring about using such a system. So that is an example of an inherently political technology. I also wanted to talk about a third kind of technology briefly before we open it up for further discussion, which is to think about a sort of recent buzzword, or some, I think artificial intelligence has been a buzzword for quite some while, and we see its applications in several domains, right from something like content moderation in on social media, on Facebook, on YouTube, or Twitter, and a host of other platforms. A lot of content moderation is AI driven, and or is increasingly AI driven. We also have systems that set prices dynamically depending on who is browsing and what their purchasing capacities might be. This is not just for products, consumer products like perhaps clothing or other kinds of products. This is also increasingly seen in things like insurance that could be more life altering than clothing could be. So again, dynamic pricing systems have increasingly been using artificial intelligence. Hiring. So there are a lot of software or tools that are being built now that would process tons of LinkedIn profiles and sort of classify and score the incoming resumes that a HR might get. So, in the near future, when we send in our resume for a job, it might not be a human who is actually looking at our resume and calling us back or not. It could actually be a machine that is just parsing our resume and deciding whether or not we're worthy of a callback. And these systems often tend to use fixed parameters like how much have they scored in their graduation, especially if it's a fresher who's applying for a job. What institution are they coming out of? Is it a tier one, nationally acclaimed, well ranked institution, or is it a college that ranks quite low in some of these ridiculous rankings, right? So all of these factors would determine and score whether an interviewee gets a call back or not. So there are systems that affect whether or not a person is going to have a job. AI is being used in such cases, and AI is also being used. I'm not sure if it's being used in India in criminal justice, but there is ample evidence of AI being used in criminal justice systems in the West, where often software are now AI systems are now being used to predict how likely it is that a certain accused might have done a crime or committed a crime or not. And this again uses historic data to say that, oh, if this is a woman of color from Mexico, aged 34, then she is likely to have committed robbery. And versus if it is a 19-year-old white male um, who is studying in Stanford, then maybe it's unlikely that he might have raped his classmate. So there are AI-based systems that are predicting likelihood of crime and are being increasingly used in criminal justice systems. So AI has been the use of AI has increased drastically over the years, and as people, both activists, researchers, and have been pointing out that some of these systems are extremely flawed and reflect deep biases in that have existed historically. Often, the kind of responses that have been given are one, oh come on, no system is perfect. It's not like we're building this with bad intentions. We don't want it to be racist. We don't want the system to be sexist, but the data is sexist. The data is racist, and it's not us, it's not our AI that did this, especially in the case of criminal justice. For example, when the historical data says that if you are a black male, you're more likely to be you historically you've always been convicted of the crime whether or not you did it. The AI system will also continue to say that, oh yes, if the person who's being accused is a black male, then they're definitely a criminal. So the one defense of AI has been that no, the system is not perfect, and we can. It is because of the data. And now that you've pointed it out, we will fix it by making some changes in the system. That is one kind of response that's been given. The other kind of response, when people have pointed out all the mistakes with these systems, is that we will build ethical AI. The idea that there are some kinds of AI that will be morally good and will not make these mistakes. And that is almost laughable because these are not sort of just moral decisions that can that depend on whether or not the developer is a good person or bad. So there have been very narrow understandings of ethics that just so it's called it's often referred to as ethics washing of any problem, where you say, is there a problem, we'll make sure it's ethical going forward, but without defining what that ethics really should be. And even in the process of defining what that ethics is, not including voices that have already been left out of the development of that technology itself. So, and then there is also the cry to build AI for social good. And I think this, in my opinion, is by far the most ridiculous, because it almost implies that other technologies have been built for social bad, and now let's start building AI for social good. But and here you can replace AI with anything, right? Like using blockchain for social good, using ML for social good, and all of those things. Any technology, how do we use it for social good? The question to ask is, why is it socially bad at all in some context that it's being used? And finally, there's also conversations in the research community where there is the notion of looking at fairness, accountability, and transparency of AI systems, which is referred to as FAT. That systems need to be made fairer, they need to be held more accountable and transparent. But often, what gets missed in these systems is that there is no recognition of power relations itself. For example, especially let's say in the cases of content moderation. If or an activist post is taken down because it is considered too violent, they say that okay, we will correct our systems to make sure that not all nudity is bad. We understand that in some cases it is used to point out a certain problem, and therefore it should not be taken down. Or when it comes to hiring, we understand that it's not that IIT people are brainies. We understand that there's a problem with that rule, and therefore we'll modify that, and the system will be made fairer. So, and in the case of criminal justice, that we will make sure that the systems don't reflect the racial prejudices of the past. The idea that somehow these systems are less accurate right now, and therefore by making them more accurate, they can be improved, and that's the direction to go in. And that's where even a framing, a well-intentioned framing like fairness, accountability, and transparency can be quite limiting. And I think the best example to think about accuracy is this in the context of facial recognition software. So initially, I don't know, I think some of you might be familiar with this. I think when facial recognition software was in its nascent stages, it was a very popular criticism against Google that it identified the faces of black people as gorillas. And they said that, oh, we can make the system more accurate by training it with faces of more black people. It is because our training set included more white people's faces that this mistake happened, and we'll make sure that it is more accurate going forward. But I think it's also important to ask is if accuracy is always desirable, because the answer sometimes may be just no. And this is an image from the Indian Express where a police officer in UP or Delhi is seen recording protesters who had assembled to protest, if I'm not wrong, against CAA and NRC. And I'm sure if any of you here had participated in some of those protests, would have seen that policemen. I saw it both in Chennai and Bangalore, that there were policemen almost instantaneously beginning to record the people who had assembled for protest, in the hope that they'll be able to recognize them using some of these facial recognition software. So, in that kind of a context, when a facial recognition software only becomes better and more accurate, then the consequence is that an already powerful agency like the police force gets more weaponry at their disposal, and which is often used against citizens who are dissenting for their rights and freedom. So therefore, which is why while thinking about digital technology like artificial intelligence, rather than thinking about it as whether it is good or bad, or even only thinking about it in terms of ethics, it is important to ask how it shifts power. And I would highly encourage all of you to read the recent article in the Nature magazine. I'm just going to paste it in the chat window, or you could just look this up uh, by searching on DuckDuckGo or any other search engine, about how we need to think about artificial intelligence systems as not whether they're being good or bad, right or wrong, or whether they're being fair enough. But the question to ask as people developing such technology is how it shifts power relations when they're deployed in like real life context. And the author says that the root problem is that power is distributed unevenly. And only when we look at it through this lens of power, it is possible to see why even the most efficient systems might actually not be very good for everyone. Even take a technology like facial recognition software. I think Bangalore Airport in India is among the earliest airports to adopt facial recognition systems. So even when they're not being used at protests and public meetings, it's important for us to ask, when these technologies are being built and deployed, whom does it give power to, and how does it change the power relation? In this case, an already skewed power relation between citizens and police is only further skewed when a technology like facial recognition software or tools is put in the hands of the police force. There are cities across the world that have now heavily regulated or even banned the use of facial recognition in policing. But I think we're yet to see such measures in India. But when we do talk about challenges or problems with some of these technologies, it's always useful and absolutely important that we think about the power relations that they reflect and how they might be shaping existing power relations. So I just want to finish with what I really liked about this piece, where the author says what is needed is a field that exposes, and the field she's referring to is artificial intelligence. What we need is an AI field that exposes and critiques such systems which concentrate power while co-creating new systems with the impacted communities. And she calls for an imagination of AI that is by the people and for the people. So, and again, I hope we're able to see parallels between the paradigms of free software and this call for AI by the people and for the people. So, with that, I would like to thank all of you for your patience and open this up for discussion. Any questions, thoughts, comments on any of these? Hi, Ganesh has shared a link to the project called Critical AI. Perhaps would you like to tell us a little bit about it?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Okay. I am in a very low bandwidth connection, so I will try to keep it simple. So we have started a collective called as uh, the that explores political nature and mathematics, and from through that collective we came to know about this critical AI. Basically, critical AI is academic as well as social activism project that concentrates on how AI systems must be looked at historically as well as how contemporarily that can uh, be criticized and to move forward with actually socially acceptable designs and stuff. That's what you have basically pointed out today. So critical AI is not only about criticizing the systems surrounding AI, it is also about how media systems should be designed, how technology should be designed. So the fundamental thing is the more we speak about technology, the more we speak about software or even design. Uh, Mathematics is one of the key area where most of them has a common language. So unless and until we keep not pushing ourselves about uh, uh, mathematics or just believing that mathematics is fundamentally objective, it also means that the other things that are created from those mathematical models, for example, technology, would be considered as subjective. So, whenever people say that technology is subjective, it is not biased. So that comes from that such a belief in perspective, which is blind. I think. So please go to critical AI, and I can read a lot of of articles about how these systems has to be viewed and has to be criticized.
Thank you so much for pointing us to that. I think we could add this later in the description of the YouTube video as well if it's useful.
Just to read out, for the YouTube, Niranjan has typed, I have a critical view on the huge forms of non-renewable sources like windmill farms, solar farms, and so on. And Whitespace has said the idea is decentralized, but scale is a question. Yeah.
Um, Niranjan says now when we have solar cells installed on a house, there will be less transmission loss. Perhaps you could tell us a little more about it so that for folks on YouTube, they're also able to follow this conversation. Your critique of huge farms of non-renewable resources versus installation of solar cells.
Yeah, so regarding the windmills, it occupies huge lands. So this needs to be installed in a place where we have good wind flow and all. So usually these windmills are installed on a farmer's land. That's what I've seen in which is in Nagarkoil. Uh, so the lands that has to be used for farming for the agricultural produce will be used to generate electricity that will be used in industries. So that's a controversial idea. And one more is like the solar farms are not going to be installed anywhere near the place where the community lives. It's going to be very far, and when the power generated from the solar farm is transmitted to the community, we have a huge transmission loss because of the distance that it has to be transmitted. We have a transmission loss in electricity when it is been transmitted. So, like when the solar cells are installed on individual community, like near the community, near a house or on our rooftops, there we will have this losses will be very much minimum. Yeah. So even even with renewable resources, there is a politics of centralization and decentralization.
Yeah, I mean, it's important. Like I think Niranjan pointed out that it is not that renewable is decentralized and non-renewable is centralized. It's important that we pay attention to differences in both those angles. Like he has pointed out, solar power too can be centralized, and by design, that is something we need to keep, or system governments and states need to keep that in mind while shifting to such renewable resources.
Ganesh has written, just putting out for the discussion. Lately, a huge rise in addictive design, especially in human machine interaction, have also created a cry for critical review. As most of the behavioral pattern are increasingly studied and mapped, its exploitative use is widely being used in a using smartphone and mass using in smartphone and camera philic culture. And coming back to this thing, the power generation, um, I I also try to stick with the decentralized models for the reason that when it comes to centralized models, though the overall production may be not sure, maybe cost effective, but the production could be cost effective, but overall the cost of a power is very 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 high, considering all the power transmission, distribution, all these. When it comes to it, the cost of the power has been always proved to be very costly than when it is very much distributed. Say for example, if it is a solar panel or something, or a small windmill or something, like it could be installed in every individual houses, and they can have their own power, whereas this has not been in practice, but it is always been the grid system, where somewhere it is being produced and transmitted over the transmission line, which adds up to the lot of cost to it. And for example, the way I say is, the kitchens, how they have transformed now. Back then, when the villages were all disconnected and off the grid, it was the firewood in their own houses they burned to cook food. But rather now, when the LPG gases and things come up, the LPG has to be produced somewhere, and then that has to be stored in cylinders, and that has to be transmitted through heavy trucks, and then distribution. All these funda comes into action. uh, to even more chaos. Now the LPGs are being supplied through pipelines also. So, like, it's all getting centralized into somewhere, and the infrastructures has to be built up, and so much of farmland has to be sacrificed for that is being happened. So when it comes to power generation and distribution, I stick to decentralized models. I think we can conclude now, if nobody else has any question or points to it. Okay, we are already 20 minutes late. We'll conclude now. Uh, First of all, thanks Shravya for coming here and giving us a good talk on does technology have politics in it. that gave us a really good and new perspective around how we see the technology, and especially when everyone read the technology problem, the title, probably they thought of digital technology, but you explained very vast spectrum of it, so that was really helpful and to understand things. It has actually opened us to new way of seeing technology as technology. And everybody else who come here for attending this session, thanks to all of you. Thanks to everyone, and we'll continue with the session further. I mean, for tomorrow we have a session on the draft EIA. Will be at the same time tomorrow, 4 to 5. The same platform where you have been getting the notification, you can get the same place. Please stay with us, and yeah. Also, if you have any other suggestion for any future talks, please contact us. Please let us know so that we can take forward any other session in the future. Once again, thanks Ravya. Thanks everyone.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me do this talk, and I absolutely enjoyed it. And I'm looking forward to tomorrow's session.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you. Bye bye. Bye bye all.
Bye.